Hi, everyone. I'm Timothy Perkins. You know the topic, science contributes significantly to human progress. And I just want to thank my opponent, Jonathan, for he came up with the topic, and really looking forward to debating this. And also, I just want to point out we have something a little different going on tonight. It's the final round of the tournament. So we're actually going to have 5 judges who have volunteered to help us determine a winner for this round. Just want to say thanks to them real quick. I'm sure Jonathan says the same. And but I still encourage you to vote. Let your thoughts be known down in the comments below, and don't forget that you can leave video comments as well. So let's start with the debate. So as already been people have been noticing down in the comments that the debate needs to be determined based on some definitions. So I want to start out with those, and Jonathan and I had a conversation about them ahead of time, so we're pretty much on the same page here. When we are talking about science, we're talking about the kind of big picture science. It's not the industry of science per se, but it's the scientific method where you see the universe, you form a hypothesis, oh, I wonder if this works that way. And then you find a way to test that, and you observe your results and confirm or deny. The kind of big picture idea of science is what we're discussing, and whether or not that contributes to human progress. So that has to do with technology, industry, society, basically how all of that ties into really improving the quality of life for humans everywhere. And so I'm taking the affirmative position on this. So let me start with a few examples of how I think science has contributed to human progress. First of all, a lot of people immediately jump to technology. Today is the age of computers. Right now we're having this debate live over cables that go hundreds and thousands of miles. And we're communicating instantly using incredibly complex machines. And that is, I think, just an incredible example, just an example of how science has improved the human condition as far as the spreading of information. So if I have an idea, or Jonathan has an idea, now thanks to QallOut.com, we can immediately just boot up our computers, throw up a webcam, and have a discussion back and forth about it. And what that leads to is I'm happier, Jonathan is happier, and those of you who are watching and benefiting from watching this, you're happier. We all, our conditions have been improved, and so I think that's a really powerful argument. As far as industry, what science has done is it has made everything cheaper and faster and better in practically every metric. Just for example, back in the 19th century, a guy named Bessemer invented the Bessemer process, where air is forced through molten steel to purify it, and it just made it super, super cheap. And as a result of that, we have cars, we have buildings that have steel siding. We have all sorts of interesting and amazing things that help improve our lives in ways that we didn't even know needed improving before. You wouldn't necessarily think, oh, I need I need an iPhone, for example. You don't necessarily think of that, but once that comes along, then you're like, whoa, my life has been improved. And most of those discoveries have come about through the scientific method of observing and forming a hypothesis, and then testing it and working it all out. And then finally, I want to address how it has affected us as a society. One of the key things has been with us understanding more about each other, the lines that we draw between each other, white versus black, man versus woman, all of those different things. We understand where there are differences that can help, but also where there are not differences that are important enough for us to for us to be fighting each other over. So, you know, it used to be once upon a time, most people thought that, you know, if you had a different skin color, if you had, you know, were from a different part of the world, that meant that you were fundamentally a different creature and that you could be treated differently because of that. But thanks to not only philosophy, but thanks to scientific testing such as genetic research and physiological research, we have been able to determine that we're all cousins. All of us, we're one big sometimes happy family, and it really has torn down a lot of the barriers that can come up between us. So those are just some examples in each of those areas. But now I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan to kind of give his take on why science does not contribute as significantly to human progress.
Thank you, Timothy. I appreciate it. I appreciate you being here, giving me the opportunity to debate this topic. Of course, thank you, QallOut, and all those people in the higher echelon taking care and making this a possibility for other people. There's probably nothing like this, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoy this. The affirmative is, of course, that science contributes significantly to human progress, and I agree with every tenet that Timothy has said. I absolutely agree with all that. What I attempt to show is that those principles are true on the surface, but when we talk about the derivative of science, the human progress that's actually occurring, such as technology and the benefits of greater understanding, knowledge, our epistemology, I believe that there is no causal link between the science structure itself and actual progression. Technology and science are used synonymously, and I believe that's kind of a misnomer. Classically, it is very difficult in philosophy of science to describe or define what science is. One different letter and you can immediately invalidate entire programs of science. What constitutes science for psychology doesn't constitute science for physics. Or for, quote unquote, pseudosciences like astrology and those kinds of things. Is how you critique and define science absolutely offsets what is constituted as science. So with the specific definition that we're using, namely the structure and the framework of science, such as the scientific method, or the peer review process, or the exchange of information, or the critiques, or those kinds of things. The overall substance of the sciences that are used in every branch, I believe, don't actually contribute to anything. Technology is the word, it's the coin word when we talk about computers and the rise of technology and building spires and the computer chip and the microprocessor, and of course, technology through NASA and satellites and gamma ray, devices and all these amazing tools that make our lives better. I believe that science is mislabeled as the technology itself, because I believe in history, technology doesn't arrive from the methodology of science itself. The 7-step process of discovering something true and acute about the world doesn't actually provide a way or a motivator in order for technology to rise out of it. So I wouldn't say per se that science doesn't give any progress to humanity, but that it gives little to closely none. The peer review process, I think, sharpens our epistemological senses in trying to figure out what is accurate and what is true. But most technology derives from social pressure or overcoming adversity or obstacles, such as war. War has been a large contributor to technology. World War II is a perfect example. Our medical industry owes all of its anesthetics and surgeries and our ability to keep bodies clean and resuscitate people are all in lieu of Nazi, human experimentation. As terrible as it is, those things derived out of terror, out of cruelty. They also arose out of the necessity to keep troops alive. I argue that science in itself and its framework has really contributed very little, because science has truly been pushed through the need of things, through social technology like hammers or paintbrushes or ways to keep food refrigerated. Those didn't arrive specifically from a 7-step process of trying to determine, which control group this or which control, how do you use placebos, but specifically a human need and a desire to actually move technology in a direction that was beneficial to people specifically. So technology arrives truly out of the need to overcome adversity or existential obstacles, like agriculture. Most of our basic engineering and most of our basic technologies, like hand tools and fulcrums and pulley systems, they were built long before our modern scientific method that comes basically from Sir Francis Bacon. Those technologies didn't arrive from any step of scientific progress. They came and arose out of the social need for those things, to make bigger and greater things out of greed, out of need, out of wonder. And so I believe that the definition that we're using here doesn't leave a casual link between the need of science and the rise in technology. And with that,
thanks, Jonathan. So what we're discussing is the causal link. So whether the 7-step, really that's kind of what we're boiling it down to, is people engaging in the 7-step process, whether that contributes significantly to human progress. And I completely agree, technology is not specifically science. Facebook isn't specifically science, even though Facebook has really innovated a whole lot of really interesting things. What we are discussing is the 7-step process and how that contributes to inventing things like Facebook or QallOut or something like that. So the reason why I'm going to disagree is because even though the initial idea might be born out of, as Jonathan was saying, necessity, such as with war, which we're going to agree isn't what we want to be motivating things, but even if the initial motivator for wanting to find something such as a bigger bomb or a way to heal a soldier faster, even if the initial push for that, the reason why we want to find the solution comes from something besides just pure scientific curiosity, the methods by which we refine that, whether it's technology or medical knowledge or what have you, is through that 7-step process. So let's just use the example of antibiotics. Antibiotics were discovered accidentally, especially penicillin. Everybody knows, this funny mold, it's killing the bacteria. What's up with that? But then, after that observation was made, then a hypothesis was formed, this mold has something in it that is killing the bacteria. And then the hypothesis was tested, and the whole 7-step process is followed. So then you arrive with the final product. And even though, the push for why we want antibiotics is because, infections kill people. And the discovery of penicillin was accidental. But how we took that knowledge and refined it and built upon it into something that could eventually be used was through the 7-step process. And otherwise, we would have we would not have a good working product. What we would have is people eating moldy bread, trying to hoping that that's going to kill the infection. So I think that you're discounting a little bit too much. Not necessarily the initial discovery, but how the scientific process is used as leverage to push our knowledge even further than it otherwise could go.
Thank you, Tim. I believe that the scientific method in and of itself is glorified a little too much. It's considered this almost triforce of scientific reasoning, and it's truly not. We use it in everyday life. You do it all the time when you're trying to discover the way things work, or where you left your car keys, or which I have to do all the time. How to build something for your daughter, how to better improve the feng shui of your house. You use these basic principles involved. So I'd say they're really almost the nature of reasoning itself. And so then it's difficult to actually kind of define the casual push from your reason abilities and the actual implications of what those reasons actually do. So I would argue that while the 7-step process is a fantastic thing, and it has done incredible things. I mean, we've put men on the moon and satellites into space, and now we know that the universe probably has a beginning because of incredible MWAP satellites and those kinds of things. That 7-step process didn't always exist, and it truly only has come into the fruition of itself now only in the past maybe 100 years, 150 years. Prior to that, man had built the pyramids. They had built Stonehenge. They had built carriages and jousting equipment and armor and swords and metal crafting and jewelry, and all these various technologies arose in a time in which technology based specifically on the 7-step process didn't really exist. Now, while we could say that maybe the 7-step process was in play, ununiformly, they didn't really know they were doing it. It's just part of the casual reasoning process, and that's probably very true. I would still argue that the byproduct of that reasoning alone is not really what brings about technology. The byproduct is, of course, always necessity, want, desire, will, the will to win a war. So you produce better medicines, maybe using the 7-step process. But then again, sometimes things have been accidental, like penicillin. So there are things in our technological world that have happened purely by chance. Or in the alchemy world, there were a lot of discoveries of modern chemistry because of accidental mix-ups. The Chinese discovered gunpowder trying to make medicine and blew themselves up and realized they could make a very powerful concoction. And so the contributor there is truly accident and not really science itself. But in the terms of what brings around the most significant advancement of human technology, it really, chronologically speaking, has been really necessity more than the 7-step process, only because of time scale. I would argue in a sliver, not the whole, kind of isolated, that most technology that mankind has used, employed, built, has begun 4,000 or 5,000 BC, stone tools, whatever, all the way up until we tried to start flying. That's about the time when the 7-step process is around being concrete. So I would say that the attributor can't be the science itself. It is a tool. It is a useful tool, and it definitely contributes, especially now. Technology enhances technology, and we're getting close to AI because of our ability to manifest, amazing leaps in technological advancement. Those still come out of curiosity and needs and wants. But I would argue that the primary brunt of technological advancements come out of sheer necessity and not really the method itself.
All right, so if I can boil your argument down and maybe give me a nod or something, necessity is the mother of invention. Is that kind of what you're going for? Okay, so, and, I don't disagree. As far as, we wanted a way to communicate over long distances, and for a long time you had to run it on foot or run it by horse, and then eventually we had the telegraph and the telephone and things like that. And necessity, the driver behind developing new things, and we're kind of focusing on technology, but I want to break away from that here in a second. The driver to get new things is to improve the human condition, which is basically what we're discussing. And I agree that necessity is the driver, if you will. It's the motivator. It's what it's what kickstarts it, if you will. But what the scientific method does, and I find it a little bit interesting that you alluded to how it's basically just casual reasoning. What the scientific method allows you to do is refine your basic want, your basic need, and point it in a direction and say, if I follow these steps, I know that I'm more likely to come to a positive outcome. So, for example, the guy finds the moldy bread is killing bacteria, and he says, wow, that could be really powerful. We want to kill infections. If I apply this 7-step process, I'm more likely to arrive at a usable result. And so even though, necessity, or, if you want to label it, entropy, everything's moving toward entropy and we're trying to fight that. Even if, that's, the basic motivator, the tools that we use are still incredibly important as to how we achieve progress. And so I kind of want to hear, maybe necessity, invention is born out of necessity, but scientific progress is the practitioner who delivers.
Thanks, Tim. Galilei, in the he's a pretty significant guy. Everyone knows him. He really is the founder of the principle that we can't be absolutely certain about any given scientific hypothesis or theory. He's the one that said we have to remain a lot more objective and say that we simply don't know. He's the idea that came up with probable reasoning. Galileo, the reason he was so successful was not necessarily that he was so much smarter than everyone else. In fact, he actually kind of stole a lot of his ideas from people from the medieval ages. But what Galileo had that no one else had was a telescope that had 10 times the power and clarity as anybody else. And because of this, he was able to see things that no one else could see. So a lot of people thought he was a kook. They thought he was kind of a fraud, and they refused to actually believe that his model that tried to support the Copernican model was actually true. And so they leaned away from it because of his technology. They were limited in their ability to actually commit productive science because of the limitation of their own technology. So prior to this scientific revolution in the medieval time frame, and people that tell you that the medieval time frames were dark and technologyless really don't know history. That was actually when science was at its peak, moving into the scientific revolution. So during that time, they didn't have the scientific method. They were simply using social pressure. I've got to plow this field. I've got to rotate it. I've got to make enough food for the town. And so I've got to create a device that allows me to use these oxen without killing them from them being beaten to death by the wooden sticks that are tied to their back. So let's invent the easel. Let's invent the iron plow. Let's invent these things. These really didn't come from the isolation of the scientific method working on a technology. And then from those steps, then a more refined science comes from it. Yes, I believe that that's true. But it was really the prior necessity that brought about the need to produce something better, which you can do with just practical, the geography of your eyes. You can literally put things together without a method whatsoever. Building Legos, you can make some incredible things without having schematics or anything like that. This really comes from the human aspect of reasoning and the power of being able to see things come together. Now, the technological advances that we have today, such as MRIs or advanced medicine or robotic surgical tools that can do spines that no human can do, I think those are probably not out of truly necessity. I think that really does come from the refinement of technology itself and not really the method itself. I don't think it comes from desire or that it specifically comes out of necessity or out of the scientific method. I think those things begat technology. Science helps refine those things, but technology gets better because of technology, not because of science. When you start to get a bunch of robotic pieces that can build and tinker at more accurate rates, you can make smaller and smaller things. You can make microprocessors. Now we have something like quad processors that are attached to a bus that are now, 4, 8, 10, processors. That's not really comes from observe, control, rethink your hypothesis. This really comes from this technology allows us to move a lot more information, which allows us to process more complicated things, which allows us to make robotics. And then robotics that have more fine-tuned and more accurate processes allow for even greater accuracy in building robots that are smaller, lighter, more complex, more cost-effective. And so I would argue that science, of course, kind of arose out of necessity. But technology itself rode out of necessity prior to even the existence of that type of methodology. And then later on, the methodology absolutely supports the advancement of our technological capabilities and our ability to think about things clearly, our ability to get to accurate information more effectively. But that only makes up just a sliver of mankind's presence in the technological world when it comes to the things that we've developed, such as the spacecraft and aeronautical engineering. These things are at the very end of human progress, which has been substantial, but that the historical motivator for technology in and of itself has not actually been science, because historically there were very, very few scientists. I mean, you had to be a wealthy, landowning white guy that was supported by the state or the church in order to actually conduct science. Otherwise, there was no job as a scientist. You didn't get paid to be a scientist. You were a natural philosopher. You were curious about the world. You tinkered with some things, or you were like Da Vinci, who contributed nothing to the scientific world, but had an incredible mind for technology, beautiful, beautiful mind for technology. So that would end with the science has contributed very little to human progress because technology has really been the primary contributor, which didn't truly derive from the method, but derives from the need, the want, the social pressure, the desire.
All right, so we're almost discussing like a chicken and the egg. Okay. Well, actually, let's not go there. So we're trying to decide whether the scientific method contributes significantly to human progress, and I'm trying to determine. And maybe you just want to nod instead of taking up your time. Are you comparing it to to overall history, or to how modern society, society of the last 200 years operates? Okay, so you're comparing it to overall history, and in that case, I'm going to agree that we didn't really have that 7-step process. We had more causal reasoning, but they are related. The 7-step process isn't something that we invented out of thin air. It came out of our it grew out of our previous ways of finding out things. We didn't have the labels, observe, hypothesize, etc., 1,000 years ago. People were still doing those things, maybe a little rougher. They weren't using as great of documentation methods, but they were still generally overall following that process, and then it got more and more refined, especially in the last 200 or 300 years. So I think maybe our disagreement isn't so much about that, whereas except that I'm arguing more that it does right now contribute significantly to human progress, and it has for the last couple of years when the scientific method has been applied. And I think that the evidence for that is pretty good, considering that over the last couple hundred years, our population has gone from a few hundred years, has gone from the millions to the billions. If we were using the agricultural methods of even the 19th century, we couldn't feed everybody. And it has been because we've applied the scientific method and discovered, the cutting edge methods to use for agriculture, for medicine, for technology, that we have been able to sustain this amount of growth and also the increases in quality of life, especially in the medical field. The the major advances medically have been as a result of scientific methodology. Of course, they were built on, there was a foundation there, from the long reach of history, but we do also know that a lot of the stuff from back then was just flat out wrong. And because of scientific methodology, because we've said, let's see, does this work? No, it doesn't. Does this work? No, it doesn't. And then when we do find something that does work, we refine it to make it better. That has been the biggest contributor to, I would argue, to human progress in the last couple hundred years. And because of that, we have been able to sustain the huge amount of growth, the incredible uptick in quality of life, and it is due to the scientific method. So while over the huge expanse of history, they didn't necessarily have the scientific method, so to speak, the 7-step process, although they were generally following it. I would say the evidence of the last couple hundred years would suggest that the scientific method, now that it is being formally followed, now that it is being more carefully applied, that is driving human progress and human population and quality of life to levels that we've never seen before. And I think that evidence speaks pretty strongly to the idea that the scientific method is really a very, very key component to human progress. And I want to bring it back to one example, and that is sanitation. So we didn't even know about germs until 150 years ago, roughly, somewhere between 125 and 150 years ago. And we discovered it because of the scientific process. Pasteur, he put finer and finer and finer filters with containers that were going together smaller and smaller to a piece of meat. And he found that, flies couldn't get in, and that he worked it down to where he's like, okay, there are microscopic creatures, and he's following scientific methodology here. There are microscopic creatures that are making us sick, and we can kill those creatures with heat. And so, we discover pasteurization, we discover how to preserve food for longer, we discover how to heal people. We discovered that there's this new class of organisms that we need to find out how to kill. That's where antibiotics comes in and is refined later on. Scientific methodology is what allows us to do all this, and it has been what has created the huge explosion of human progress in the last 200 years.
Thanks, Tim. I would say that there isn't a whole lot of motivation to conduct science for the sake of science. I think that there are people absolutely in history who've had that mentality. They want to simply do science because they enjoy the processes of science. But the majority of the history has really been, if you consider what science has produced versus what the social world has produced, such as the cell phone or the oven or the automobile, the casual technology. I would say the primary majority of technology doesn't derive from scientists in a lab. If you could count up all the scientists who've ever been scientists, I think they would make up a fragment of a percent of the human population. I would argue that the majority of the human population has produced these amazing technologies without actually adhering to science whatsoever, such as Henry Ford. Henry Ford was not a scientist, and in the production of I think he was an engineer, but at the production of the piston engine and developing the first model car was truly out of want or need to apply that technology to other people. I want to produce a car that drives across the land, that allows people to get from point A to point B very quickly. And that is not itself the byproduct of the scientific method. Now, the scientific method over time on an engineering level has absolutely aided that process, of course. How combustion fuels have been made more effective and higher octanes, up to 180 octane fuel that used in like nitromethane cars and those kinds of things. Those are absolutely the byproduct of research chemistry and research engineering and those kinds of things. So the improvement of technology has absolutely been in relationship to our ability to control information through the methodological processes that science provides. However, the majority of technology, the refrigerator and the train and the automobile and the electric, the Franklin stove and even the usage of electricity have all come out of either curiosity, have come out of a refinement of discovery, but not specifically because these people adhered to the methodology of the 7-step process, but because of the desire to continue to keep producing better technology. And of course, as I argued before, technology enhances technology, not specifically because of the scientific method, but because making a better hammer allows you to produce better equipment, allows you to create enhanced structures. And of course, enhanced structures allows you to house more perishable things. Better refrigerators allow you to have food longer and for greater expanses of time. So when trying to qualify how the method causes those types of progresses, I think is very tricky. As well as I believe the motivators can be found in a more broad or more apparent sense, such as the need to eat, sex drive. The sex industry has gotten incredible. They can make almost an entire human being, minus it being conscious, that you can make love to, and that does not come from the scientific method. That comes out of a desire to enjoy sexual intimacy on demand. So I can't think of a whole lot of technologies that actually are the byproduct of the methodologies, but I can think of principal theories that truly are the byproduct of those methodologies, such as the Big Bang Theory, or the oscillating model, or biological evolution and neo-Darwinianism, natural selection. Those types of things come purely from control groups and deductive reasoning and inference to the best explanation, and the various components of philosophical and scientific thinking truly do come from those methodologies. But how does knowing how humans evolve from a primate or a biogenesis, and they come from single-celled organisms and grow into more highly complex forms, how does that help the progress of mankind? I don't think it does. While it enhances our understanding, it doesn't aid in progress. Technology seems to be more the primary mover of progress, better medicines. And I agree, absolutely. I think the methodology of sciences shine the greatest in the medicine.
Jonathan, it looks like you're out of time. Thank you very much. I just want to really briefly go over that. You said right toward the beginning, I took a note here, you said most of the time people haven't done science for science's sake. And I think that you're right, but that has changed due to science. People have discovered, and I'm going to relate this back to quality of life, people discovered, science is, relatively speaking, as an industry, this big, new, shiny thing that anybody can participate in. And people are now doing it for science's sake. And the reason why they are able to do that is because they aren't dying as young. They don't have to work in agriculture to keep from starving. They aren't going to war as much, relating it back to social sciences. And so I think that the fact that people are doing it more is an evidence for this, but human desire to grow ourselves, to acquire more knowledge, is part of human progress. And so the more that we are adding on to human knowledge, the more that we're adding on to the more we are growing as persons, that is a fundamental part of human progress as well. It's not just about cars and all of that. And I want to link back to that real quick. Henry Ford may not have been a scientist, but he hired scientists. He hired scientists to, make sure that it wasn't going to blow up. He hired scientists to tell him what types of fuel to use and things like that. The Franklin stove. Ben Franklin observed that, you know, if your source of heat is in the middle of the room, then it warms up the room better. And then he built a stove based on that and tested it. And I really think that over the past couple hundred years, the fact that we've been utilizing the scientific method to have this explosion in human progress is evidence that it contributes to it a little more significantly.